This is the secret part of the stream where I'm not actually streaming, but I am recording. I'm adjusting my microphone and eating food. ASMR eating stream. I'm going to get 1 million followers. Alright, I'm going to switch over to the reading stream. There we go. Okay, transition. All right. Ignore all the tabs up in the top. I'm only going to be reading from this one. So I don't know. It looks like we got 2 people in the chat. Maybe 2 people. 2 people. So this story is it's primarily JaneRezi. It's a noir alternate universe. This is set in the 1930s on Earth. It is set in a version of Earth where the Alternians showed up in like the 1900s and became like a big part of human society, and they changed world events because there's like millions of them. So like some things haven't happened, like World War I was prevented, World War II didn't happen. There's a lot of Alternians in Europe. I should like write a fic about that sometime. And Jane is a private investigator who she lives in New York, and the first story is about her like basically investigating a bunch of murders in New York, and like it turns out that a bunch of rich people are basically doing a bunch of bad things, like human trafficking and stuff. So Terezi helps her, and they end up in a relationship, and also they're running like a private investigator. They're basically like charitable private investigators. Yeah. Yes, it's very, very unbelievable that the rich people are doing bad things, right? So like Jade ends up like inheriting her family's fortune after her grandfather, who's the one doing the human trafficking, is killed, and she like immediately donates most of it and like funds all these causes. Yes, this is a continuation of the one in Boston, so I'll do a quick plot summary. So anyway, they're working like they work like charity cases, basically, like people that the police won't help and stuff like that. So at the beginning of the story, Vriska shows up in their office and is like, hey, some weird stuff is happening. Like Vriska and June are together, and they're living in Boston, and they're getting like, June is getting these weird letters that Vriska has been able to intercept, talking about like this weird like culty sounding shit, and she's freaked out about it. And together, yes, they're in a relationship. June is like a city plan. She works like the city planners and does charity work on the side, and Vriska is basically working for organized crime and wants to be an actress. Yeah, that's like, it was a big part of the one set in New York, was their relationship. So Vriska is like basically, hey, help me figure out what the fuck is going on, and they come across all these like weird kind of culty like language and talking about this weird shadowy stuff happening, and no one's really sure what the fuck is going on. They go to Vriska and June are like basically up in the North Shore in Massachusetts, just trying to get away from the city because they are pretty sure someone was like in their house. And there's this weird town nearby that's got a bunch of people that are like being really shady, and there's references to this like cult group around. So nothing really big has happened, although Jane has this really like bizarre dream about like a railway tunnel that leads to something, and there's like a voice talking to her and shit. So hold on, let me grab my monitor headphones here, because I got my ones that don't tell me what I sound like in. There we go. Cool. All right. So that's basically where we're at. Porum is big in this. She is like the head of the Boston Alternian organized crime group, and I say organized crime, but they're basically just like, they're kind of there to help people in ways that the government won't, especially Alternians, but other people too. Like Boston is implied to be pretty like diverse, and then the Alternians aren't segregated like they are in some places. Um, yeah, basically. Yeah, they basically are. Like, not all of them are like that. Like, the Boston one is implied to be one of the better ones. The one in New York was, like, horribly corrupt and terrible, but they're pretty much gone now because of the events of the last story. But yeah, they're kind of like organized crime, but not quite in the way that we understand it because they're not human. So their social standards are different. Oh. Anyway, let me start here. This is Past, Present, Past, Chapter 7, The Queen Lost Her Crown, Gloucester, Massachusetts. Lucky for us, there was a hotel in Gloucester that had a private phone line. I slipped an entire Washington to the fellow behind the counter in exchange for a chance to use it without getting a room. When he was gone and I was sure we wouldn't be disturbed, I dialed the operator and got a connection to Fairy Tale, the club in Harlem that Rose, Roxy, and Kanaya all ran together. The line rang for a bit before a familiar-sounding voice answered on the other end. "Hello, this is Fairy Tale." "Rose?" I asked into the receiver. "It's Jane Crocker." There was a brief pause. "Jane? What in the world are you doing calling?" "Is this a party line?" I had to know before I said anything else. Too much uncertainty. Another pause. "No, why? What's this about?" "I'm up in Gloucester with JaneRezi. We were in a town called Seaward Vale asking after some things, and I saw an old flyer with the name Lalande on it. Referred to them as a heretic. This time the wait was longer, almost a full minute. I could hear the receiver being moved around, so I knew she was still on the other end. I've got to check something out. Can you give me an address where you're staying?" I told her Vriska's address, and she thanked me before hanging up. I groaned. This wasn't very helpful," I said. JaneRezi shook her head.
"She was scared,"
JaneRezi said quietly.
"I could hear it in her voice even over the phone. Something's wrong."
"No kidding. Something's wrong all the heck over this place." I decided that it would be good to check in with Vriska, so I dialed the operator again and had me put her through to Vriska's house. It was June who answered. She recognized my voice right away.
"Hello, Jane."
She sounded worried.
"Vriska was wondering where you went. She got an important call. I'd better let her explain."
There was a rustling and Vriska's voice on the other end of the line.
"Where the hell are you two?"
Yeah, I like writing noir a lot. It's so much fun.
"I need you to come back down here."
"We were up in Gloucester. Needed to check out a lead," I said. "What's going on?"
"I got a call from Dirk a little while ago. He says there's something going on with Purim, and he needs someone to come help out as soon as possible."
North End, Boston. In the end, I had volunteered to take the Buick and drive back down to Boston while JaneRezi stayed back up in Gloucester with Vriska and June. She promised to try to dig up some more leads while she was up there, see if maybe she could kick a few things loose in Seaward Vale or thereabouts. It was about an hour back to the city from Vriska's place, and as soon as possible sounded urgent enough that I went straight there, revolver tucked securely in its holster under my suit jacket. I drove out of Gloucester as fast as I could, passing the cutoff for the strange town of Seaward Vale a little bit faster than I strictly needed to. As I was whipping down the road, I almost clipped a hitchhiker wearing a long hooded cloak that covered their face entirely. Of course, that was the kind of weird nonsense I was going to see. I had no time for any of it. I didn't like not having JaneRezi with me. I'd mostly worked alone before I met her, but ever since the whole stink in New York, I'd come to really rely on her. I mean, aside from the fact that we were having a bit of a tumble whenever the mood struck, and aside from the fact that I was quite sure I was madly in love with her. Aside from both those facts, she made a heck of a partner on a case. She could sense things I couldn't even dream of, and despite being completely... Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And despite being completely blind, was somehow an amazing shot with her Colt. She had a very direct way about her that worked well with my tendency to be a bit more reserved. In short, I was missing her right then, but I also didn't want to leave Vriska and Rose alone up in Gloucester. I was getting a bad feeling that the whole deal about that whole deal as of late, and I knew JaneRezi was as well. Neither of us wanted to keep things escalating. When I finally pulled up to the Alternian Social Club in Boston, I got the feeling that I might not be able to stop that from happening anyway. Several very rough-looking fellows were posted up outside the social club, visibly armed with shotguns and Tommy guns. I parked the Buick on the curb and walked up. The boys at the door saw me and moved aside to let me in. No searching, no checks for weapons. Something bad was happening inside. As if on cue, as soon as the door closed behind me, I heard 2 gunshots ring out above me. I drew my revolver and started running, pushing to the back of the club and through the open security door. As soon as I rounded the stairs, I saw Dirk standing there with his hands out, motioning for me to put my piece away. Careful. She's locked herself inside the office and won't come out. She keeps firing the damn gun through the walls. Tavros is a bouncer in New York, actually. He's in the first story. He doesn't come back, but he is in the first story. And he ends up all right. He doesn't get killed or anything. He's just still working as a bouncer. I holstered my own gun and settled myself against the wall of the stairwell. I know, yeah. He's portrayed as being like a really big dude who works as a bouncer at a little club in the Bowery. Basically like a speakeasy, except Prohibition never happened in this AU. What the heck is she doing up there in there, I asked. Dirk frowned. No idea. She was in her office all morning by herself and wouldn't answer, but I could hear her crying. I called Vriska for help with her. She started shooting maybe, I don't know, 15 minutes ago. There was another crack of gunfire from inside the office. I had no idea where the bullet had gone. I hoped it hadn't ended up in someone's apartment. I groaned to myself. What the hell had I done to deserve this? Have you been able to talk to her? No, he said while looking directly at the floor. She won't answer any of us. Get downstairs and stay there with your goons until I come back. I'm going to try to talk to her alone. Dirk opened his mouth as if to respond, then apparently thought better of it. He was looking down the stairs without a word, and I was alone with the woman shooting randomly through the walls. Great. This was going great. Hey, Bucky, how you doing? We just started reading, so you haven't really missed anything. Poor Miz locked herself in her office and is shooting at things randomly. And that's pretty much it. Everything else is what you heard last time. I walked up to the door and knocked, hunkered down in case she decided I would make a good target. Miss Merriam, it's Jane Crocker. We met a couple days ago. From inside the room, I heard a laugh. Porum was laughing, and that made me deeply uncomfortable. Jane Crocker, she called out from inside the room. It sounded strange. Jane Crocker, P.I., Private Eye. You still looking for answers? This struck me as an odd question, but I wanted to humor her, on account of the gun. Yes, Miss Merriam, still chasing down leads. You were very helpful earlier. Was there something else you wanted to tell me? She laughed again, a high-pitched, unsettling sound. Have you started dreaming yet? The words froze in my throat. Has he called out to you? Does he watch over you? Does he see you? Another laugh, trailing off. I couldn't hear anything except the muffled sound of Porum moving around inside the office. Miss Merriam, I called out, hoping to keep her talking. Eventually I'd have to break in the door, unless she decided she wanted to suddenly change her mind about this whole thing and let me in. No response. There was more shuffling around inside the office. The sound of a drawer slamming shut. A chair being knocked over. Probably. JaneRezi could have told me exactly how it fell. Another laugh, this time from further inside the office. Silence. And then a scream. I braced myself and got ready to kick in the door. I was hoping that Dirk and the boys hadn't broken it down out of respect or fear, and not because it was barricaded, because otherwise this was gonna hurt. I kicked the door right next to the doorknob, giving all my weight into the blow. The wood was flimsier than I expected, and the latch splintered out of the door frame as the door burst open. The room was a mess, stuff strewn all over the place, desk cleared off, chair tossed. Porum was in a corner over by one of the windows. The gun was sitting on the desk next to a green telephone, so at least she wasn't planning on shooting me. I ran over to the side of the desk, and I could already see the blood staining the carpet, trailing over to where Porum was on her knees by the window. She had something in her hand, kept flicking her hand over. I got up next to her, and I could see she had a razor blade held in her hand. Her arms were a mass of slashes, and the jade blood was oozing out onto the floor.
I reached down and gingerly took the blade from her. She didn't bother to resist. "Hello, Jane." She looked over at me and smiled, but her eyes looked vacant. "You wait here," I basically yelled it at her. I grabbed the razor blade and the gun from the table and ran back downstairs, around the bend. Dirk was sitting there with his goons. "Do you have bandages?" Dirk looked at me, confused. No. What happened?" "Shit, just get me as many clean towels as you can from the bar. Hurry the heck up, Porum's hurt." One of the goons had run to the bar and came back with a handful of towels. With those in hand and Dirk in tow, I ran back upstairs and over to Porum. She was still on her knees, still smiling vacantly. I pressed the towels up against her bloody arms. Most of the slashes looked shallow, lucky break. Dirk came up to hold the towels in place, so I was able to clean up some of the blood near Porum and take a quick look around for anything unusual. The office looked pretty much the same as I remember. It didn't look like anyone was there. I remember the door off to the side, the one Dirk had disappeared into. "Does the door back here lead down to the street?" I asked. Dirk shook his head. "No, it's just a couple back rooms we use as storage and offices." Porum looked over at me and smiled again. I really wish she'd stop doing that. "You've seen it too, haven't you?" she said. Dirk was pressing the makeshift bandages into her arms and trying to shush her at the same time. "Saw what?" I asked. "The tunnel, of course. The tunnel at the end of the line." Her eyes rolled back and she swayed. She would have hit the floor if Dirk hadn't been there to stop her from falling. My heart was racing. There was no way she could have known. I hadn't even told JaneRezi the details. There was no way Porum could have known. I looked right at Dirk. "Is there somewhere you can take her that's safe? I have a feeling you don't want the law involved." Dirk shook his head. "I don't care about the law. Most of the coppers around here owe Miss Merriam anyway. I'm worried about the damn loony bin. If the wrong person sees this, that's where she's headed. You think Miss Merriam doesn't still have enemies here?" I was quite sure she did. This seemed like a reasonable line of reasoning. So do you have somewhere to take her or not?" Dirk sighed. "Yes, I can keep her at my place until she's doing better. I got some fellas I trust to help keep watch." "Sure, swell. That sounded swell." My heart was still tap dancing inside my chest, so I just nodded at Dirk as he helped Porum to her feet and carried her downstairs. I was left alone in the office, looking around at a mess of tossed decorations and light green blood. I waited until I was sure they were out of the building before I started looking around the office. The desk itself was cleared, but on the wooden top there were fresh scratches. I looked them over, saw what looked like a crude drawing of a set of railroad tracks leading to a tunnel. That tight feeling in my chest wasn't going away. I scanned over the desk, already knowing what I was going to see. Alpha Circle Omega. Of course. I closed my eyes and walked away from the desk. The room was getting all fuzzy, and I felt like I was going to fall over if I didn't sit down. I walked to the windows, hoping to open one and get some fresh air. There was something written on the floor, right beyond the edge of the carpet. It was written in blood. I had overlooked it in my rush to get Porum help. North of Vale. I had no idea what it meant, but I felt like it was maybe not something that should be left there. I grabbed a discarded piece of bar towel that was left behind from treating Porum and smudged out the writing until it was nothing but a green streak on the floor. Then I walked over to the window and opened it, letting the fresh air wash over me. The phone was ringing. I leaned my head out the window and groaned. My heart was still racing. There was no way that Porum could have known about that dream. Maybe it was all a coincidence. That was what people who ended up dead in the woods somewhere always thought. The phone was ringing. I looked back inside, and yes, the office phone was ringing. I ran over and stopped in front of it. I was worried. I wasn't sure. Oh, forget it. I picked the phone up.
"Miriam, where's Jane?"
It was JaneRezi. She sounded panicked. "No, this is Jane," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from 1,000 miles away. Porum had some kind of accident. That Dirk fella's watching over her."
Shit. Listen, Jane, you have to get back here right the hell now."
"What's wrong?" Further and further. It felt like I was drifting.
"June's gone. She went out for a walk and never came back. Frisk is freaking the hell out, and you need to get back here now."
Drifting. I let the phone fall to the desk with a thump and stared out the window. Somewhere, There was a rail line that led to a tunnel. A tunnel that led to...
Chapter 8. Stalemate. Gloucester, Massachusetts.
I drove back even faster than I'd come down, hoping to beat the twilight. I flew up the roads, through the sleepy pine-scented backwoods, then the wonderfully fresh sea air as I moved up toward the coast. That late afternoon sun would have, under any other circumstances, been a welcome pleasure. Instead, it just reminded me of the passage of time, the inevitable march towards uncertainty that I was trying desperately to escape. Moving up through Seaward Vale, I once again passed the hooded hitchhiker. I was reconsidering whether they were even a hitchhiker in the first place, given that they hadn't moved a whole lot in the past 3 hours or so. I pushed the thought out of my mind. It wasn't important. I was up past Seaward Vale, and before I knew it, I was pulling up in front of Vriska's home. JaneRezi was already in front of the looming building, pacing back and forth. No doubt she'd heard the car coming a ways back. I was expected.
Holy shit, thank God you're here.
JaneRezi ran over and hugged me as soon as I stepped out into the paved driveway. What happened? Where did June go before she disappeared? JaneRezi let go of me and stepped back.
She was out walking in the area and just didn't come back. Listen, we've got to press Vriska a little bit more. She might not know much about this, but there's something she's not coming out and saying. Shit, maybe not something she's even aware of, but if we keep doing this bullshit dance, we're never getting anywhere.
She was right. I already knew it. We walked inside together, passing through the grand foyer and back into a small study off the main hallway. Vriska was sitting inside a leather-upholstered armchair and gnawing furiously at her fingernails.
Oh, thank God,
she said as soon as she saw me. Her face was a mask of hidden pain.
What the hell is happening? Where's June?
I stood across from her, looking down at where she sat in the armchair. Poor Miriam was cutting her wrists and writing in her own blood. Vriska's eyes went wide. I didn't add the part about the dreams. That sounded a little crazy, even given the circumstances. I kept going. We keep seeing the same symbols everywhere. An A, a circle, and a weird kind of horseshoe thing. The folks down in town don't seem to like you much. And now June's gone missing. You're not helping June by leaving out information right now. Vriska was looking down at her foot, and her foot was tapping nervously.
I don't know who they are. I went into town a couple times, and they seemed to already know me and wouldn't talk to me. Eventually, I just gave up. Went into Gloucester if I needed to, and kept it just me and June if she was with me. All the weird shit, all the symbols and the order of the creators. None of that means anything to me.
JaneRezi had been breathing deeply. She grunted.
Yeah, she's telling the truth. I mean, at least as much as she knows it anyway.
I sighed. That was about the best I was going to be able to hope for. Okay, what about Porum? Is there anything you know that would connect her to any of this? Vriska shook her head.
I don't know. Porum might be a dangerous bitch, but she's also smart, and she's good for Boston. If you crossed her, she'd fucking kill you. But if you didn't, she was perfectly fine.
Vriska stopped, turned her head skyward. Thought.
But I've never seen her freaked out by anything. There's more to that story.
You grew up in Boston? I asked. Vriska made a seesaw motion with her hand. Kind of.
Not really. I was born near here, but I was taken to New York when I was a wriggler, a little kid. I actually got put into foster care with the Lalondes. Grew up, went back to Boston with Kanaya for a little bit. Trolls might not have the same family thing humans do, but the Miriam name counted for enough to get my foot in the door with Porum while she was cleaning house up here. Kanaya and I broke up, and she moved back to New York. I stayed here. Not the most exciting story, really.
Given everything that had happened in the last few years, I was inclined to agree. After all, what was a little organized crime between friends? I was in the uncomfortable position of trying to turn the facts over in my head and get a clearer picture of exactly what the heck was happening. I didn't even feel right calling this a case anymore because it was spiraling out of control, turning into something I couldn't identify. And I had that crawling feeling in the back of my head that I had more pieces than I realized. Just didn't have a way to put them together. It reminded me of another place and another time. An apartment 3 years back with a murder that looked like a suicide. A trail of clues that had all pointed in one direction and then zigged when it was supposed to be zagging. I turned away from Vriska and leaned over to JaneRezi, dropping my voice. I have no gosh darn clue where to go from here, other than poking around town to see if anyone knows about anything about June. It feels like a bad plan.
Cool. Yeah, do it. You're right, and you should say so.
It is a bad plan,
JaneRezi sighed.
but it's the only one we have right now.
I promised Vriska we'd find June. A promise felt like overselling what I could deliver, but I made it anyway. With that done, JaneRezi and I excused ourselves to go think over our plan and try to get some kind of information out of the locals.
Seward Vale, Massachusetts. Oh, am I going to have to do this fucking New England accent again? Yeah, I think I am.
We decided that we would both wait until a little later that evening when the locals would be back from their work on the ocean and the bars would start to fill up a bit. Both JaneRezi and I agreed that this was our best chance of actually finding out anything, even if it meant putting more time between June's disappearance and the present. The whole situation stunk. June wasn't going to wander off into the woods and get lost, and she hadn't seemed like she wanted to run. If anything, she wanted to stay close to Vriska because Vriska did everything in her power to keep her gal safe. Of course, the conclusion we'd both already come to was that June had likely been grabbed by someone, most likely connected to the strange letter and the whole Order of the Creators song and dance. At least they seemed interested in probably keeping her alive. Maybe some kind of ransom thing, or a power move against Porham's Boston Council. Those pieces hadn't revealed themselves yet. Once again we were at the Fisher's Rest and feeling distinctly unwelcome. The joint was a bit busier than before. Lots of locals piled in to grab drinks after a long day out on the ocean. The bartender was the same tall, slick-haired man with the thick New England accent we'd seen earlier the same day. He glared at us.
Thought I told you to leave. I cannot do a New England accent.
Thought I told you to leave. He kept glaring at us as he turned to serve a local.
Don't have anything else to say to you.
We walked up to the bar and took seats. I smiled and tapped the bar. I'll have whatever's on tap. The bartender shook his head.
Tap's fresh out.
I heard JaneRezi scoff from next to me and cocked my head. That's too bad. I'll have a bottle of whatever beer you've got.
Beer's for locals.
Fine, I said, still smiling. Then I'll have a nice slice of information about the disappearance of a dame who went walking earlier today. I studied the bartender's face as he heard this, and I knew that JaneRezi would be studying everything I couldn't see. The glare dropped a little and his mouth faltered.
Don't know what you mean by that. No gals in here except locals.
I felt JaneRezi tap my thighs and glanced over to see her cock her head a certain way. He wasn't lying, exactly, but he was leaving a lot out. I don't think she was in here, but I'd like to know if you know anything about a gal who went missing while she took a walk a little ways north of here, up toward the circuit place. The mention of circuit got a little bit of a frown out of him. I figured it would, but he mostly stayed cool. Just looked kind of annoyed.
Don't know why that'd be any of my concern,
he said, looking over to take a quarter from a waiting local. He produced a bottle of the locals' only beer from under the counter and handed it over. For a minute, I thought he might not even have been lying about the tap. It's just a question, I said. As a private eye, I've been hired to look into the disappearance. Any information you would be welcome. The bartender shrugged his shoulders.
Probably went up to Gloucester way. Not much down here for a city gal anyway. Maybe got herself on a train back to Boston. Went back to the life she was accustomed to.
I kept myself calm outside, but that felt like a bit of a tell. I hadn't said anything about where June was from. Boston was a fair assumption, sure, but it seemed awfully specific. I would ask JaneRezi about it when we got out, but for now things were feeling like they were about to hit a dead end. I had one last hand to play. One other thing. Does the name Lalonde mean anything to you? His body language changed so quickly it almost gave me whiplash. He stiffened up and drew himself back a bit. Whatever he was about to start saying was going to be carefully considered and most likely absolute bullshit.
And where did you hear that?
I shrugged. Nowhere in particular. Just came up during our investigation. Wanted to ask around.
Well, you'd better ask somewhere else about that. Get the fuck out of my bar.
He was reaching under the counter, and I had no desire to be on the receiving end of another firearm. I tugged Terezi's arm, and we were up and...
Cool. Okay, I'm going to... I guess Bucky's probably still in the chat. Bucky might want to grab that for tomorrow because we're going to be doing the Bucky and Clever Will It Homestuck ? Fanfic read is tomorrow. So yeah, if you've got a story, that would be awesome. Thank you, Bucky, and please feel free to stick around. I'm reading the Jane and JaneRezi detective noir film or fiction with a lot of weird like sort of Lovecraftian horror elements being introduced. Where the fuck was I? Oh yeah.
I tugged Terezi's arm, and we were up and on our way before the bartender had a chance to do anything else to us. Back in the Buick, and on our way back to Vriska's, I turned to Terezi as she sat in the passenger seat. I don't need your talents to know he was lying his butt off and hiding a whole bunch from us. Terezi nodded.
Yeah, no kidding. I don't think he was lying about her not being in the bar, but he knows more about her disappearance than he let on. I don't know what the lawn thing was about, but I'm guessing it's related to the flyer we found.
I guessed that as well. We lapsed back into silence as we drove to Vriska's house, and I kept turning the scant facts I did have around and around.
Gloucester, Massachusetts.
Vriska turned in early. I went to check on her, but I could hear crying from inside her bedroom, so I decided it would be in better taste to let her be by herself for the moment. There was a note left in the study that told us we were welcome to use one of the guest bedrooms. Sheets, the note told us, were already on the bed, and we could use the bathroom to wash up if we wanted. Neither of us felt like doing that. We were exhausted. Terezi and I went upstairs, latched the door on the bedroom behind us, and promptly proceeded to strip down and collapse in a heap on the bed together. I held Terezi close to me, the heat of her naked form seeping into mine. It was comforting, and I was so very tired. I felt a groan escape my throat. I hate this all so much, I heard myself saying, almost felt detached from it. We've got nothing solid to go on. I'm so darn scared that something bad is going to happen, but we can't do anything about it right now. Terezi ran her fingers along my shoulders and back, tracing delicate lines with her nails that faded as soon as they appeared.
It's okay,
she said, her hands stopping to rest gently on my back.
We'll do our best to get her back.
I know, but still. I was trying not to sound as frustrated as I felt. I didn't want Terezi to get the idea that I was mad at her. I wasn't. I was mad at the whole damn order of things that brought us to this point. By the logic of story conventions, June and Vriska should have had a nice happy ending after the crap they went through in New York. That obviously had not happened. I needed to be held, to be comforted. I'd spent so many years building up the walls that had protected me before. The walls I thought had protected me. But the truth was, I was just as vulnerable as anyone else. Being with Terezi had given me a safe place to let my guard down. Right then, it was non-existent. I was crying. Terezi was already scooting up on the bed to cradle me against her chest. Her skin was smooth and warm, and I could hear her heart beating softly beneath her breast. But I was still crying. She ran her hand up my cheek, gently wiping the tears as they fell. "I'm sorry," I said it with a sob. I'm being a gosh darn mess right now." Back and forth, Terezi was rocking me slightly.
It's fine, Jane. I love you.
I sniffed. I love you too. I'm just worried.
I know, Jane.
Terezi held me a little bit closer.
You're doing what you can. That's all anyone can ask.
Of course she was right, but that didn't make it any easier to hear. I lay there for a long time, not saying anything and just listening to the gentle whomp-whomp of my gal's heart. At some point, I dropped off to sleep, even if I couldn't tell you exactly when. The rail line and the tunnel were there again, but now I was standing on the other side of the tunnel. I didn't know how I knew this, but it was the truth. I had crossed over and reached the destination that called to me from beyond.
"Welcome home, daughter."
I felt afraid, but also I felt welcomed. It didn't actually feel like coming home, Home for me was an abstraction so far removed from my reality, it might as well have been on another planet. Long Island mansions I would never again be welcome inside. But this felt like destiny. It was where I was supposed to be, and maybe that was home after all.
Come to us, daughter. Come meet the rest of your family.
I half expected the hooded figures from before to be sitting there, crouching, waiting for something I didn't have the words to describe. But instead I looked forward and I saw June. She was wearing a long hooded cloak, but I could still make out her face through the shadows. She looked at me.
Do you know the role you have to play?
I had to admit that I didn't.
Do you know the role that I have to play?
Again, I was drawing a bit of a blank. This was all turning too cryptic for me.
Look to the heavens.
June reached up, pointing skyward. I looked up as well. All above me, the sky was on fire. Burning embers crashed to the ground and lit everything around me on fire. The fire did not burn me, but I knew it would consume all that it touched. In front of me, June looked skyward, and she laughed. I screamed.
Chapter 9, The Connected World.
The scream was still on my lips as I woke, flailing and reaching for a gun that was, fortunately, not where I thought it was. I rolled over in the bed, narrowly missed clocking JaneRezi, and stumbled onto the carpeted floor, completely naked and still patting myself as if my Smith & Wesson would be concealed somewhere on me. As the waking world came into focus, I struggled to calm myself and breathe. I looked over and saw JaneRezi holding her hand out to me. Without saying a word, I grabbed her hand and she drew me in close. Oh, God, it was all I could manage.
You're in Vriska's guest room, she said calmly. Whatever it wasn't real.
She was right, except I didn't think she was right. There was something here, something out here, hiding in the shadows, something both malevolent and patient, something north of Vale. I was trying to clear my head, and it wasn't working. I had no clear sense of how long I'd been asleep, what time it was, or even what exactly was happening. JaneRezi kept holding me, her touch a comforting touchstone against the imagery of the dream. Of course it was my subconscious playing tricks on me, my anxiety and stress taking over and turning my own mind against me. Except I didn't think that was right either. That would require too many coincidences to line up just right, and that didn't feel like it made much sense to me. Okay, I'm okay, I told JaneRezi, my rapid heartbeat betraying the falsehood in the claim. Just let me put some clothes on. I stepped away from JaneRezi's gentle embrace and with great reluctance and walked to our small weekend bags to pick out some clothes. Whether or not we had planned to start our day already, I wasn't going back to sleep. I would love to pretend that the phone rang at just that opportune moment when we stepped out of the bedroom. It would be, narratively speaking, extremely well timed. But this is life, not a story, and the phone didn't ring for at least another hour. JaneRezi and I got breakfast in the kitchen, and I avoided talking about my nightmare, brushing it off as anxiety. Vriska joined us eventually, looking like she hadn't slept very much at all. It was when we all gathered together at the table when the phone in Vriska's study began to ring. We all ran to answer, and Vriska picked up the receiver. She almost immediately handed it to me. "Hello?" I asked, unsure if I was going to like what I heard on the other end. "Jane? Oh, thank God I was able to get through to you." It was Rose on the other end of the line, and she sounded frantic. In fact, she didn't even wait for me to respond. "I need to meet you and Vriska in Boston. This is most urgent. It can't wait." "Rose, June is missing," I almost yelled into the phone. "This really isn't the... Fuck. Then I need to speak to you now. I'm getting on the first train up to Boston. I'll be there by noon. You and Vriska meet me at Faneuil Hall. That's important. I need to speak to Vriska as well." She hung up the phone, and without waiting for a response, I looked over at JaneRezi, who nodded. Of course, she'd heard the conversation.
Go. I'll stay here and see if I can find anything else.
Vriska and I packed...
Wait, oh no, it's JaneRezi.
Go. I'll stay here and see if I can find anything else.
Vriska and I packed light and planned to spend the night in the city if we needed to. I kissed JaneRezi goodbye, maybe a bit longer than I was originally planning to, but I kept getting that sinking feeling in my guts. June was missing, and the clues we had found only opened things up more and didn't bring us any closer to finding her. I hoped that Terezi could find out more, and whatever Rose had for us was worth it.
Faneuil Hall, Boston.
In the 3 decades since the Alternians first came to Boston, the area in and around Faneuil Hall had grown from a kind of marketplace to a full-on cultural exchange. Trolls and humans gathered to trade their own local food, crafts, ideas, and information. It was almost always busy, easy to get lost in the crowd. It was also considered neutral ground by everyone. The Boston Council left the place alone, and what few human organized crime syndicates still operated in the area complied with the Council's version of Pax Alternia. Vriska and I arrived before Rose and spent some time wandering around. Vriska was mostly acting nervous and jittery, understandable, and I was mostly checking to make sure we weren't being followed by anyone suspicious. The last time I'd met in a public place to get mysterious information had ended badly, and I didn't want to repeat of the same problem. Rose arrived about a half hour later, decked out in a pair of smart trousers and a cream-colored blouse. As put together as she always looked, something was clearly on her mind. She flagged Vriska and me down right away. We need to get somewhere we can talk, she said. I looked over at Vriska, the only person here who really knew the area. Vriska nodded.
There's an Alternian restaurant nearby. I know the owner, and it'll give us a place to talk.
The restaurant was only a short walk from Faneuil Hall itself, kind of tucked off into a corner. It had a glowing neon sign written in a curving script that I recognized as Alternian, but had no idea how to interpret. The inside of the restaurant was quiet and mostly empty. The light was dim and pleasant, and I could smell something from the back that was surprisingly appetizing to a very human nose. There was a short troll behind the counter who smiled as we walked in. The troll was dressed in a baggy sweater and wore a floppy hat that partially obscured their face. Got a voice for her.
Vriska, long time no see.
The troll glanced around nervously, her face suddenly falling.
This isn't council business, is it?
Vriska smiled at her as we approached the counter.
Don't worry, Boulder. This is personal. We just need somewhere quiet to talk privately for a few minutes.
Boulder, as the short troll was apparently called, led us to a table in the back of the restaurant.
I'll keep the guests away if anyone comes in, okay?
She asked with a smile. Vriska smiled back.
Sure, Boulder.
Now that we were all seated, I turned to Rose. It was time to stop dancing around like this. Okay, what the heck is going on and what's so dang important? This is taking time away from us looking for June, so it better be real gosh darn good. Rose took a deep breath, as if she were trying to steady herself before unloading a great burden. I know how you must be feeling. Don't you give us that patronizing... Oh, that's a Vriska line. Oops.
Don't you give us that patronizing shit, Lalonde.
Vriska interrupted.
My gal's gone, and all you can do is talk about how we must be feeling? Fuck you.
Rose shook her head. I hate to say this, but I think what I have to say may relate to June's disappearance. Vriska glowered.
Okay, so spit it out then, Lalonde.
I'm not exactly sure where to start, but Vriska, how much do you remember about when you were a wriggler? Like a really little wriggler, right after your grubbing? Vriska shrugged.
Nothing, basically. I remember being in the troll foster system in New York, and that was pretty much a big pile of shit. Then I moved to Boston once Kanai and I broke up, and that was a whole thing.
Rose looked from me to Vriska. So, nothing about before you were in New York?
God, no. How many times do I need to say it?
I thought so. Okay. Then I guess I should start this story at the very beginning. My family comes from a long line of folks who claimed, at various times, to be able to practice forms of magic, witchcraft, to be able to communicate with beings from beyond this plane of existence. Whether or not any of it is true, I have no idea, but the important part is that they believed it. A lot of other folks believed it too. Sometimes those folks were hostile towards my family, enough to where they often sought solitude that would put them away from those who judged them for just wanting to practice their religion in peace. In the early part of this century, my mother, Violet Lalonde, and the members of her family were getting ready to make a move from the town of Salem in Massachusetts to somewhere with a less contentious relationship with witchcraft. As luck would have it, this was around the time that the Alternians began showing up in force from their world. The idea of a whole other universe and the travel between it opened up all kinds of possibilities in my mother's eyes, and she found a bunch of Alternians who felt the way she did. I know Alternians... It is always Salem. I know Alternians don't typically go with human family structures, but there was one group of them who had kind of adopted the idea. The group who also claimed to be able to manipulate the forces of magic. The Circuits.
Wait, what the fuck?
Vriska started to rise up from her chair, but Rose put out a hand and Vriska sat back down. The Circuits became quite close to my mother. I don't know the name of the original member of the family that she had contact with. That information has been lost to anyone who's still alive. But, see, eventually the Circuits and the Lalondes decided they were going to just give up and make their own town. They moved north towards Gloucester and formed a town out in the woods where folks would be unlikely to stumble on it by accident. A few years went by, and my mother had her first daughter. That was my sister Roxy. The Circuit matriarch had created a grub as well. That was a troll named Arania Circuit. The original Circuit decided to treat the Wriggler like a human child and raise her as if she were an actual daughter in this village that she and Violet had helped form. And then, about 27 or 8 years ago, another human child was born. That was me. And there was another grub as well, a troll named Vriska. This time Vriska actually stood up, and I saw her eyes grow wide.
That's bullshit. There's no way.
I don't... Rose put out another hand, and her expression looked sad. Vriska sat down again, nervously rubbing the fingers of one hand with the other. The thing is, something happened between the Circuits and the Lalondes in that village. I was too young to remember, and Roxy wasn't much older. She remembers there being some kind of fire or something, and being rushed out of the village with me and Vriska. We would have been so small at the time. I don't remember it, and obviously Vriska doesn't either. When we got to New York, my mother was gone. Rose stopped telling her story, and her face fell. I could see tears streaking her cheeks and heard a small, strangled sob escape her throat. I don't know how it happened, but I know that she was killed. I assume the Circuit matriarch was killed as well. That's basically got us up to the present day. More or less, as far as I can tell you. I noticed that she very pointedly avoided saying anything about the ultimate fate of Arania Circuit. I wasn't sure if that was a specifically sore spot, or if it was just something she didn't know much about, but the omission was worrying. Rose was still looking, and the tears were still welling up. When you mentioned that flyer that talked about my mom, and I'm sure it meant my mom, I got really worried. I never went back up there, and I never thought much about it, but it sounds like someone up there has been thinking a lot about her. I shook my head. This is a damn fascinating lesson, but how does it relate back to what happened to June? In case you haven't noticed, we're still very much under the gun on that. I think, Rose said, that her disappearance might have something to do with folks up there, and that seemed to at least know who my mom is. It feels like too much of a coincidence that they targeted June when she's so close to Vriska, the last Circuit still at large. That felt like a telling statement, too, but I didn't push it right then. It was a lot to take in. I wasn't sure how she was going to respond, but I needed to ask. Can you come back to Gloucester with us? I know it's probably a heck of a lot to ask, but we really need help finding June. Rose opened her mouth, then seemed to think better of what she was going to say and closed it again. She waited before finally responding. I don't know how I feel about it, but I also feel like it's something that needs to be done. Fine. She stood up from the table. Let's go. Together we stood up and walked out, bidding Boldear goodbye as we left the restaurant. Outside, the crowd was getting thick as the afternoon wore on, and folks started coming back from their lunches, choosing to stroll leisurely through the market instead and dawdle a while before heading back. We were about halfway to the car when I heard a terrible and familiar sound. The crack of a rifle began to echo off the nearby buildings. a sound battering at my eardrums. As the tempo of the gunfire increased, I saw the first of the crowd drop. 2 trolls went down, brilliant spots of color expanding from their backs. Everything was moving too slowly. As the shooting continued, the crowd seemed to be moving like thick syrup. They were confused, startled by this sudden interruption. I was too, and I'd been shot at before. More people went down, a handful of trolls and some humans that were chatting with each other and hadn't been quick enough to move out of the way when the shooting started. If it weren't for Vriska, I would have been next on the list. She shoved me down, landing hard on top of me with a grunt. Bullets passed so close by I could hear them snap in the air above my head. Rose had already thrown herself to the ground behind us, and she started to crawl forward. The crowd was running everywhere, and I could see where the shooting was coming from. I couldn't see where the shooting was coming from, but it was still happening. All at once, the sea of people parted, and I saw them. A large troll holding a Browning automatic rifle. He was reloading, but he saw me. I froze. My hands were locked in place, painfully far from the revolver I had slung in my shoulder holster. I felt hands reaching around my midsection, and Vriska had drawn my revolver from the holster. She sighted down the barrel and squeezed the trigger until only the spent casings were rotating around. She missed the first 2 shots by a mile, but the other 4 connected and the troll went down hard. His BAR clattered to the cobblestone street as he dropped like a sack of rotten potatoes. Vriska had her arm up under my shoulder and was hauling me to my feet. Rose was already standing.
"We need to get the fuck out of here!"
Vriska yelled. I nodded like an ass and followed along as she led us to the car. I had no interest in sticking around to see if there was another shooter waiting. Let the cops figure that one out. Vriska floored it and the car jumped to life, roaring down the street and away from the scene of ghastly slaughter that had played itself out before our very eyes. Once we had put a couple miles between us and the massacre, Vriska pulled the car over. She was breathing hard, almost hyperventilating.
We need to get back up north.
She was gasping as she talked. No. Rose interrupted her from the back seat. We need to go to Miskatonic.
Very good. To Donkey's nod.
Miskatonic was a small town to the south of Boston and was, as far as I knew, known only for its third-rate college and asylum. Why? I asked. Rose looked down. Because I didn't tell you something before. This didn't surprise me. The other circuit, Arania. She's in Miskatonic Asylum. That did surprise me. It was also profoundly bad news.
Okay,
Vriska said it with a gasp.
Fine, if it'll help me find June. But I need to rest. I can't do this.
She was visibly shaking. Also, even if we left right then, the asylum would be unlikely to allow visitors that arrived later in the afternoon. Fine. Let's get off the street, though, and let me drive, I said. Vriska nodded weakly, and we switched seats and headed for a nearby hotel. It wasn't the Ritz, but it was clean, and it wasn't currently being filled full of lead by a goon with a BAR, so it would do. We ended up splitting 2 rooms, with Rose taking one and Vriska and I in the other. The room Vriska and I were in had a bed and a couch on it, so I agreed to take the couch while she got the bed. Truth be told, I didn't care much one way or the other. Once the adrenaline wore off, I was exhausted, and I was just happy to have a place to get some rest. We ventured out to eat and poke our heads around for a bit in the late afternoon. Folks were talking about the shootout downtown, and the coppers had apparently been out already and weren't overly concerned with finding the specific person or persons who'd filled the original shooter full of holes. Information wasn't exactly forthcoming, and I knew it'd be half rumors and speculation anyway. Not even worth paying attention to. That evening we were back in the hotel room, and Vriska came and sat next to me on the couch.
I'm so fucking scared.
It was a bold choice for a cold open, for sure. I wasn't quite sure what to say, so I didn't say anything.
I'm so scared for June. I don't know where she is or what's happening to her. I feel so bad for dragging her into this.
Heck, I wouldn't say you dragged her into this. Vriska shook her head.
Why not? You heard what Rose was saying. This is tied back to me, at least a little bit. June's got nothing to do with any of it. This is just like New York all over again. I'm just a fucking weak spot. A fucking black mark on her life.
Vriska was crying. No question or doubt, she was leaking from both eyes right down the front of her shirt. She sobbed, and I reached out to put my hand on her shoulder. It felt like the right thing to do. I'm just so fucking useless at this. I love her so much, and I do anything to keep her safe, but she keeps ending up in danger. She doesn't deserve this. You know June's this... she's such a good person. She cares so much about everyone. Vriska paused, sobbed loudly, and leaned against my shoulder. Even me. She cares so much about me, and I don't even know why the hell she does. I wasn't going to pretend that I was especially well versed in either of their personal lives. We'd ended up bonding in a peculiar way through our shared experiences, but that wasn't really the same as being a part of someone's life. I felt like I was closer to Vriska, and June by extension, than some random person on the street, but closer in the way that you got when the same folks were shooting at you a lot. But still, I felt like I needed to say something. Vriska, I can tell how much you both love each other. I've seen you willing to go to war with the council to keep June safe. You love her, and you do what you can to make her happy. I don't know what else you can expect from yourself. The sobbing stopped, and Vriska hiccuped. I know. I just want her to be safe, and I want her to be happy. I can't help it. I feel like maybe sometimes that she doesn't deserve to be with someone so damaged all the time. You know? Personally, I'd found that my damage had sought its own level. I'd ended up in a relationship with someone who was, at the end of the day, very similar to myself in that regard. So maybe I didn't know exactly, but I also understood where Vriska was coming from. At the very least, I could understand how she felt about the woman she loved so dearly. Right then, I missed JaneRezi something fierce. I was still working on sheer terror from earlier in the day, and I wasn't going to come down until the morning. I would have given anything to be able to hold JaneRezi and feel that sense of comfort. Even if it was only for an hour or two, it didn't matter. She might as well have been on the other side of the world. Vriska, I said, I don't think it's a question of being worthy or not, or any of that. June's a grown woman who's making her own decisions to be with you. Stop second-guessing yourself so much and trust her judgment. You understand? I heard Vriska laugh lightly, and she settled against me. This woman, who had been a stone-cold killer just a few hours ago, who was, despite all of her bombastic personality, another half-broken victim of circumstances. Life had a way of doing that, of taking us and turning us into caricatures of what we once were. I felt like Vriska understood this somewhere deep inside herself. I think that's one of the reasons she loved June so deeply, because June brought out the best elements of who she really was when all the masks were taken off and put away. Because June understood how that kind of thing worked maybe better than anyone, and was able to look past it and see into Vriska's heart. I thought about that for a while in silence, and it was 10 minutes before I realized that Vriska had fallen asleep leaning against me. I didn't want to wake her, so I just sat there and waited for sleep to claim me as well. It would be several hours before it did, and in the end, I would wish it hadn't.
Chapter 10, Impatient.
Vriska was lying in the middle of the field, not moving. There was blue blood everywhere. So much blood. That by itself would have been plenty shocking, but the fact that June was standing over her, smeared in her lover's blue blood, was really the icing on the cake. I was about to scream, but something inside me stopped it, because I was the one standing over Vriska's body. I had my revolver out, and I felt a weight in my hand. It was on my head. It was a crown on my head. I don't know how I knew it, but it was a certainty. I had a crown, my revolver, and I was laughing. I was laughing and pointing my Smith & Wesson down at Vriska. She wasn't dead. Near it, but not quite. She struggled to turn herself and looked up at me. Help! She barely managed to get the words out. I clenched my grip around the revolver's cool handle, and everything inside me was fighting this. But it felt so right. Do it. She needs to understand
They need to know the penalty for betrayal.
And, as much as I hate to admit it, there was a certain convincing power to those words. I wanted to pull the trigger, to see the brilliant cerulean blood splatter on the floor as Vriska's essence left her, and she became yet another withered, traitorous husk on the floor. The shock of waking was matched only by the realization of what I was doing. I had gotten up from the couch. I was holding my revolver in my right hand. I was pointing my gun directly at Vriska, who was still sleeping on the bed. My eyes went wide as I was fully awake, and I immediately decocked the revolver and set it down. I could feel a well of panic rising up, threatening to overwhelm me. I'll admit that I'm not as quick with a heater as my gal JaneRezi, but that didn't mean I was a stranger to holding iron. I knew not to wave the thing around like a damn toy. I shook my head, as if that would somehow clear it. Outside, the daylight was just coming in over the horizon. It couldn't have been any later than 6 a.m. This was too gosh darn much for me. I'd been getting weird feelings since we started on this case, and sleepwalking into nearly blowing my acquaintance's head off wasn't exactly helping the matter. I walked over and shook Vriska awake.
What is it?
She sounded tired, of course. She probably hadn't gotten to sleep right away with everything on her mind. We're getting Rose, and we're driving to Miskatonic. I don't care what time it is. We need to get the heck out of Boston. I need to get the heck out of Boston. Before heading out, I made one stop at a local telegram office and had them write up a message to deliver to JaneRezi as soon as possible. JaneRezi, we were attacked but are okay. Attacker is dead. Be very cautious. Going to Miskatonic Asylum. Send word to front desk of your findings. Be careful. With love, from Jane. I hoped it would reach her shortly, but we didn't have time to try to get in touch with her directly. We had a bit of a drive, and we had important business to attend to as soon as possible.
Miskatonic, Massachusetts.
Miskatonic, tucked to the southeast of Boston, about halfway to Cape Cod, was a surprisingly unpleasant little town. Its two defining features were the Miskatonic College and, of course, the Miskatonic Asylum. The college was scarcely worthy of the title, notable only in that it had a large library full of dubiously sourced books on the occult. There were professors that taught courses in the stuff here, and I couldn't help but wonder how they'd been able to stay afloat all these years. Rumors abounded, Vriska had told us, about a secret donor who'd been largely funding the continued existence of the college for years. Surrounding the college was a scattered collection of housing and local businesses, catering primarily to the few active students. This mostly consisted of a luncheonette and a small general store. The housing was mostly in various states of poor repair, and I didn't envy the students who had to make their homes there. The asylum rose up out of the trees as we approached. Someone had decided the thing it needed was to have a massive Gothic clock tower attached to the front of it. Once we were past the trees, it looked like a massive squat fortress that had been sandwiched into the middle of this generally unappealing town. It added to the distinctly oppressive atmosphere of the place. Make sure you study, or you'll end up in the loony bin with all the other crazies. I shuddered, and very abruptly did not want to be anywhere near Miskatonic or its hulking asylum. But it didn't matter, because we were pulling up and parking, and then we were walking inside the massive entry doors, and I felt small and afraid. This was a place of pain and torment, not of healing. The lobby was all cool gray stone, austere and off-putting. The front desk of the asylum stood at the far end, with a white-shirted woman with her hair tied back up into a bun, sitting there reading a pulp novel. "Can I help you?" She sounded bored as she looked up from the book and glanced over at us. Fortunately, Vriska had called ahead and dropped enough council names to get us to on Arania Circuit's visitor list. She'd left my name and agency, just as an extra measure against them giving us a hard time.
"We're here to see Arania Circuit," Vriska said, "under the name of Jane with Pyrope and Crucker, investigators. We're expected."
The woman nodded, looking unimpressed, and checked a small notebook sitting next to her. She scanned down, nodded, and reached out to take a telegram envelope from under a small pile of papers. "Here, this came a little while ago. When you're ready, Jimmy will take you back to see the patient." I took the envelope and quickly opened it. Sure enough, it was a response from JaneRezi.
"Jane, glad you're okay. Something came up here. Someone following me in town. Keeping distance, but same smell as before. Doesn't know I'm aware. Return to Gloucester ASAP. We'll be careful. Love, JaneRezi.
And that was more bad news. JaneRezi could take care of herself better than anyone, but I couldn't help but worry about her. Not to mention if the same folks who followed her that had tried to ice us at Faneuil Hall. That would be bad. I didn't have time to worry about it right then. Our only lead was in here, and I needed to talk to her. So I waited with Rose and Vriska for Jimmy to come out. Jimmy was a big fella, 6'5", probably 300 pounds of pure corn-fed muscle. He was wearing a crisp white uniform and not smiling. I didn't like Jimmy very much. He grunted at us and motioned for us to follow. So we went back through a series of locked doors, past rows of rooms that were basically just cells. Finally, we came to one room that was like all the others. Jimmy nodded.
This is her.
He liked to keep things short and simple, I saw. He opened the door to the cell, and I looked inside. The padded gray walls of the cell were stained here and there with blue. I could only assume that was Arania's blood. In the middle of the room sat Arania herself, facing away from us. She turned, and I gasped. She looked just like Vriska, the only main difference being that she had shorter hair, and one of her eyes was covered in a bandage that showed the telltale blue stains of her blood. She was wearing a loose-fitting white shirt and pants. These were also stained blue in places. Her wrists and arms were covered in marks like she'd been picking at them with her claws. If the asylum had been doing anything to prevent her from hurting herself, it wasn't immediately apparent. Arania looked over at us with a glazed, glassy expression in her good eye. When she got to Rose, not Vriska, but Rose, her eye widened and her mouth twisted.
Violet.
She bent over and started crying, holding herself and rocking back and forth on the padded floor. Rose walked closer to her, still keeping her back a bit.
Oh, Violet, thank God you're here. I thought you'd never come back, and they'd just try to keep me in here forever. I tried so hard to tell them about the tunnel and the tracks and all the fire. They told me I was crazy.
My mind was racing. This wasn't the first time I'd heard my own bizarre dreamscape echoed by someone who had no way of knowing what I had been seeing.
I thought you were dead,
Arania said.
Violet, they told me you were dead, but I never really believed them.
She looked over at Vriska and her eye opened wide.
Vriska? Oh my God, you're so big now. My little sister, you were just a baby when I saw you last.
Her use of the human words wasn't lost on me. I stepped forward. Arania, my name is Jane Crocker. I'm an investigator working for Vriska here. Arania nodded.
Yes, like Sherlock Holmes. I loved those books as a child. Is the game afoot?
She laughed, but it sounded sad. After a fashion, I said, Arania, this isn't Violet here. This is her daughter, Rose. I'm here to investigate the connection between Violet's death, a kidnapping, and the Order of the Creator. It wasn't quite the truth. I wasn't sure how all the pieces fit together, but I had enough to start forming hypotheses and seeing how they checked out. Judging by the fact that Arania made a sign I didn't recognize over her heart and gasped, I felt like I was hitting home.
No, Alpha, Omega, the circle that binds. You're dealing with dark, evil forces.
I know, I said. I was tired. This was tiring, and I was so far beyond trying to play it cool. They tried to kill us yesterday. I need to know what they want from us. I need to know what they mean by the air. I need to know more than I do because a young woman's life is in danger. I was still mixing what I knew with pure speculation, but Arania only seemed to grow more afraid. I wished JaneRezi was there to help confirm it, but I felt like I was stumbling into a decently sized vein of the truth. Arania looked down and sobbed. She began to pick at her arm, then stopped.
I told him I didn't want to go back. I told Cankry I couldn't go back.
My head started to hurt all the way in the back, crawling up the spine.
I told Cankry and he didn't listen. I was in my hotel and I was going to take the train to New York in the morning. I knew Violet had sent her kin there. I wanted to find my family, but they came in the night and they took me away.
The headache was spreading out into the top of my head now. My vision was getting fuzzy. Where did they take you? I asked. Arania shivered.
Back to the village. It's the place I grew up. They rebuilt it, but it's not like it was. It's evil now. Cankry made it into a bad place.
Where is the village? I needed to know. My headache was getting worse.
North of Seaward Vale. Go along the old road until you find the old railroad tracks. Follow them north to the tunnel and keep going through. It's partially blocked, but it'll take you into the woods. That's where they live now, in the ruins of the old village.
I took a step backward, but I was stumbling. The headache was so bad I could barely see straight. I think I was able to say something before I passed out. But it wasn't anything anyone could understand. And then everything went black.
She was afraid of her gift.
Everything was black around me.
Arania was too weak and stupid to understand what I offered her.
I knew that I was inside the tunnel.
I gave her the chance to become a god.
The tunnel was opening to a shallow valley lined with thick trees, and in the valley there was a village that had been ravaged by fire and time and then rebuilt into a shadow version of itself. The village that had no name.
How dare she reject my gifts?
But
you wouldn't do such a thing, would you?
When my eyes opened again, I was lying on a cot in the middle of a white-walled room. Above me, the water-stained ceiling sprawled in all of its squalor. I strained to look around and saw Rose and Vriska sitting in a nearby chair. It looked like I was in whatever passed for an infirmary in this place. My suspicion was confirmed when a short fellow wearing a white coat walked up to me, smiling.
"Oh my, you had a bit of a spill,"
he said.
"Looks like maybe you fainted. Didn't get enough in you to eat this morning."
He laughed. "Water," I managed to get out. My throat was burning.
"It's okay," he said. "It happens. Get you some water. No problem."
He left and returned with a glass. I downed it in a couple gulps and handed it back. Feeling a bit better, I swung my legs out over the side of the cot and put my feet down. Before I could ask him another question, I heard someone yelling from another room down the hall. "I don't belong here!" Vriska gasped.
"Porum?"
I glared at the doctor. "What the heck is going on here?" He shook his head.
"I'm sorry, but I can't disclose sensitive information about our operations or patients. But rest assured, I've trained directly under the great Jacob Harley back during his heyday, when he was perfecting the Harley method of mental well-being."
The doctor smiled. I needed to talk to Porum, and I needed to do it right now. I saw an opportunity. I made my move. "So was that before or after Jacob Harley decided to start selling little girls out to disgusting older men?" The doctor's face went indescribably pale. He stammered. He stuttered. "Give me your coat, or I'm going to start digging into your past, and I'm not going to stop until I hit something worth holding over your head." I could see by his expression that he was absolutely terrified, and he had good reason to be. I might not be as quick with a gun or as adept at finding liars out as JaneRezi, but there was no one better at chasing down information that didn't want to be found. Without another word, the doctor handed me his coat. I took off my own suit jacket and slipped on the white doctor's coat.
So that's actually Grandpa Harley in this world. It's Jake English is not a good person in this world, but he was just like an enforcer. It's actually the Grandpa Harley, who's not a character in the original Homestuck. Not like the Grandpa Harley from Homestuck, but like a different one. Yeah, and he was a real bad dude.
It didn't fit perfectly, but it was close enough. "Watch him," I said to Vriska and Rose. "I'll be right back. If he tries to move, stop him." I walked around the corner toward where I could still hear Porum's voice. I checked carefully to make sure that Billy wasn't one of the orderlies attending, but instead
I just realized that she messed up his name. That's funny. That's actually a neat little detail.
But instead it was two shorter men wearing the same white uniform. I walked up, looking as official as I could. "Excuse me, gentlemen, but this woman is my patient, and I won't have you manhandling her like this." They snapped upright and looked extremely nervous. I saw a glint of recognition in Porum's eye and the faintest trace of a smile on her lips. "Gentlemen, I need a moment to speak with this patient in her room. I'll knock when I need you fellows to let me out again." They nodded enthusiastically, eager to preserve their jobs, and let Porum and I into the room. "Miss Merriam, right? I believe you'll find that this will all be cleared up soon." As soon as the door closed and I knew we couldn't be heard, I walked over and dropped the act. "What the heck, Porum?" She glared. But she wasn't going to be Miss Merriam, not considering the circumstances. I thought Dirk was supposed to be taking you home to rest. She sighed and shook her head. I don't know what happened. Dirk took me back home, and I went to sleep. But then he went out the next day to finish up some stuff at the club. While he was gone, two goons busted in the door and hauled me off here. They kept me in a little cell for a day, and then they were taking me over here. Listen, you, I don't have a lot of time before this whole act comes crashing down, so I need to make this quick. What do you remember about the day you had your breakdown? I remember being at my desk, and I think I fell asleep. I had some kind of dream, something about a tunnel, and I could see myself sitting on a throne, and there were bodies at my feet. So many bodies. When I woke up, it felt like someone was going to try to get in, so I started shooting, I think. So far, this was beginning to sound eerily familiar. What about the cuts on your arms? Why did you do that? She looked down, ashamed. I don't have any idea. I don't remember doing that. I just remember that Dirk took me home, and it was like a fog was gradually lifting, and my arms hurt so much. But I couldn't remember why. Purim probably thought it wasn't helpful information, but I disagreed. A picture was forming in my mind of what had happened, of what was happening, one I didn't like, but also one I was having trouble escaping from. Okay, last question, and I have to get a heck of a lot out... get the heck out of here before someone figures out what I'm doing. Do you know anything about a village north of Seaward Vale that burned down a couple decades back? Also, does the name Cankry mean anything to you? Purim put her head down and pursed her lips. The village seems to ring a bell. I've heard rumors about a troll and human community up that way. The name doesn't sound familiar, though. Is that the name of the place? I shook my head, but I didn't elaborate. I didn't have time to waste. Last one. I need you to tell me about the order of the Creator, or the phrase, the Alpha, the Omega, and the circle it binds. She looked uncomfortable, but she relented. Fine. I don't know much about what they are. Just that I've been seeing and hearing about their flyers around the city. Folks getting hassled by them. Always very mysterious, and never leading back to anyone. I see their symbol around. The Greek letters for Alpha and Omega, and a weird dashed circle. That was what that was. I hadn't recognized the Greek, and just assumed it was a letter A and some weird nonsense character. But you seemed afraid before, I said. I remember what JaneRezi had said. She smelled afraid, but it wasn't fresh. That seemed important. Like something they did in the past. No, not specifically. Nothing I could prove, just... She paused and looked around, as if someone might be watching. When people started asking questions before, they always vanished without a trace. There was another private eye that came around once, hired by some missing kid's family. He found some of the same clues that you did, but then we arranged a meeting to swap information, and he never showed. I figured he probably just skipped back to wherever he'd come from, but in the back of the mind, I always wondered. It happened a couple more times, and I realized that it wasn't just some coincidence. Okay, fine. Look, as much as I hate to say this, you should probably stay here for now. It's probably safer than outside, at least for the moment. I'll get in touch with Dirk soon, and he can help you get out of here and back to safety. Purim didn't look at all happy with that particular outcome, but she didn't have a choice. I knocked sharply on the cell door, and one of the guards let me out. They left me alone after shutting Purim up in her cell, and I strolled back to the infirmary, careful not to draw any more attention to myself. I handed back the doctor's coat and reiterated that if he told a single soul what had happened, I was going to find a way to personally destroy him in every conceivable sense of the word.
Well?
Vriska asked. She had a slightly hopeful gleam in her eye. We have to go back to your house. I have a very strong feeling that I know where June's been taken.
Cool. I was hoping that I would get to this part of the story because this is where the story gets like really fucking weird and great. I don't know if I'm going to finish this tonight, but I am pretty far. Maybe. I'll at least get to do some of the weird stuff. Chapter 11, The Unnamed Village, Gloucester, Massachusetts.
By the time we got back to Vriska's house in Gloucester, it was already starting to get dark out. I didn't really think it would be such a swell idea for us to all try to marching into this mysterious village in the middle of the night, so I put in my suggestion that we spend the night at Frisco's and then all of us head out into the morning. The first thing waiting for me when I stepped out of the car was JaneRezi. She ran toward me and wrapped her arms around me in a way that was very out of sorts for her.
Oh shit, don't ever do that again, Jane.
She was sobbing and holding me and pressing herself as close as she could.
Thank God you're okay. I don't know what I would have done. Thank God.
I put my arms around her waist and pressed up against her, letting my forehead rest against the top of her head, right between her velvet-covered horns. I'm sorry. That was basically all I could think of, and I felt like an absolute fool saying something so weak after almost getting killed, but there it was. JaneRezi was still crying.
It's okay. I'm just glad you're okay.
She let go of me and took my hand.
Yeah, that's I don't remember where I got that headcanon from, but the idea that the troll's horns are covered with like a very thin layer of skin and fuzz, kind of like deer antlers, or at least like young deer antlers. I don't have any clue where I got that from now, but I thought it was a really cute little like headcanon, so I'm like, it's gonna be my little random detail about troll anatomy for this AU. It's mentioned in the first story, so that's not completely out of nowhere. Blah 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 blah.
Vriska and Rose had already gone in. I suppose they didn't want to intrude on such a personal moment. I could hear Rose on the telephone in the other room. It sounded like she was talking to Kanaya and reassuring her that they were okay. Seemed to be a lot of that going around, with the almost getting shot and all that.
Are we even sure this is a good idea?
JaneRezi asked, grabbing my arm.
I mean, I'm all for going in guns blazing, but it sounds like this could turn into New York City all over again.
I wasn't gonna lie. That was something I was afraid of, too. And it seemed a lot more low-key before that tough mug with the BAR had started shooting at us. So either the folks leaving all the creepy flyers around everywhere were more well-equipped than we thought, or they had friends who were real movers and shakers. The end result was the same, and I didn't like it one bit. But still, what else could we do? I don't like it either, I responded. But I don't really see what choice we have. This is about our only lead right now. Everything traces back to whatever's happening in the village up north.
Yeah, if we can even find the place.
JaneRezi snapped back, her brow furrowed. She sounded more worried than actually convinced that finding it would be at all difficult. I had this uncomfortable feeling that we were being drawn there now. But by who or what, I couldn't say, but everything was lining up a little too perfectly.
You know what? Forget it. We'll go in the morning. It's not like things get much worse.
JaneRezi sounded angry. I wasn't sure what it was. She sounded emotional in any case. She turned and walked up the stairs, headed toward the guest room we were sharing, so I followed after. She didn't say anything else, just stormed into the bedroom with me on her heels. I closed the door softly behind us and walked over to where she was standing by the bed. JaneRezi, what's wrong? Her head was bowed. I moved closer and I could hear her crying softly. I put my hand on her shoulder. And I was on the bed. JaneRezi twisted and pushed me back. She was on top of me and pressing herself down with her arms around my back. She was sobbing, loud and ragged now.
Oh, God, Jane, please don't do this again.
I could feel JaneRezi's body shaking as she cried. I reached up and slipped my arms around her waist, pulling her down into an embrace. I could feel the tears dripping on the side of my face and didn't care. My gal was hurting. I was hurting.
Okay,
it's all right. I'm not going anywhere. I held her tightly, and I could feel her warmth as she pressed against me. If you'd asked me a few years back, I wouldn't have thought it was possible to love someone so much, to care about another person this way.
I love you so much.
JaneRezi sniffled loudly. She let go of me and sat back, perching on my hips and smiling at me.
I can't say I thought I lost you because I didn't know, but fuck. I felt like I might lose you at any moment. I'm glad you're back.
I started to smile and...
You all have your roles to play.
I was in the village. I'd never been to this place in my life, but I knew it as a certainty. I was in the center of the village, and in front of me there was a great pile, a heaped mass of dead bodies. Hundreds of dead bodies in various states of decay with a variety of horrible injuries. Blood stained the dirt below. And on top of the pile, JaneRezi sat. She was looking down at me, and she was smiling. But it was a smile that lacked any trace of her personality. The smile of a thing that wore JaneRezi's face, but was definitely not JaneRezi.
In time, you will learn to accept this. Holy shit, Jane, are you okay?
JaneRezi was next to me, kneeling on the bed and holding me by the shoulders. I struggled to sit up, but my body felt heavy. I groaned and looked up at JaneRezi. Her face was lined with fear. I started, then stopped. My head felt like someone had just decided to go to town with a sledgehammer on the inside. What happened?
You passed out. I don't know why, but you were out for like a goddamn hour.
She was leaning in and hugging me, pulling me in close.
Please, I don't want anything to happen to you. I'm serious. I'll be really mad if you fucking die or something.
I could hear Vriska and Rose somewhere nearby, talking. Couldn't quite make out what they were saying, but it sounded important. For a second, I wondered if it had anything to do with me. It probably did. I managed to get that much out. Very coherent. I need to talk to you. I reached out for JaneRezi's hand. She must have felt me moving because she immediately grabbed it and squeezed it.
Okay, what is it?
I've been having dreams.
Yeah, I can imagine. After everything you've been through in the last couple days.
JaneRezi squeezed my hand again. The gal was tough when she wanted to be, but she was a darn sweetheart deep down inside. No, I don't mean just random dreams. It started a few days ago when we were in Boston looking for leads on the Order of the Creator. These dreams about a rail line leading to a tunnel. Beyond the tunnel there was a village. I watched JaneRezi's face as the realization dawned.
That can't be right. You must have heard something somewhere.
No, this was all before we knew anything about the village up north. I keep seeing these visions in my dreams and hearing this one specific voice. It says all kinds of odd stuff, but it never makes sense. JaneRezi was frowning. The thing is, I've started blacking out and having these same visions. And I talked to Purim in the asylum. She talked about having the same experience. I don't mean similar. I mean she had the same visions of the rail line and the tunnel.
So what the hell does it mean?
JaneRezi asked, her voice quiet. I don't have any dang idea, but something about that village scares the heck out of me. It felt like a massive understatement as I said it.
If you feel like that, we don't have to.
Yeah, we do. I'm getting a hunch that June may have ended up there, or at least there's a clue to where she is. It's too much of a coincidence. JaneRezi leaned in and kissed me on the cheek.
Look, try to get some actual sleep. We'll leave first thing in the morning.
I smiled at her and reached out to touch her cheek. Like I said before, I didn't know it was possible to love someone so much. I linked my fingers in a lock of her hair and pulled her back to me. This time when we kissed, our lips pressed together and I closed my eyes. The kiss lasted for a while, and when it was done, my face was still close to hers. JaneRezi, I whispered, thank you for everything. I love you.
North of Seward Vale, Massachusetts.
The road continued for several miles beyond the outer limits of Seward Vale, then turned into a dirt road. After another mile of that, it became what could be more charitably described as a lane, and finally into more of a walking path. Once it narrowed down to the point where it was no longer passable in a car, Vriska pulled over and shut off the engine. We were really doing this. JaneRezi and I both had our pieces hidden under our suit jackets, but Vriska was being less subtle. She had the dang lever-action rifle out and was openly carrying it at her side. Her eyes blazed with a fury I'd seen only once before, right before Mina Pisces had met the business end of a very pointed piece of metal. Vriska was going to get June back. That was something I had no doubt of. Rose was unarmed. She had insisted that she didn't need a gun. I wasn't going to argue with her on that point because honestly it didn't matter. If it came down to it, one more person who might not even know how to use a firearm properly wasn't going to make a difference. The gal had guts, though. I'd give her that. Out of the car, we began to walk down the dirt path as it continued among the trees. The further we got, the more still and quiet the air seemed to get. Birds stopped chirping, and the only noise left was that of our own footsteps against the scrabbly earth underneath. We walked for a half hour before we saw it, the railroad tracks. I felt a wave of nausea cross over me as soon as I recognized them for what they were. And they would lead to a tunnel, and that was where we had to go. The nausea passed, but I felt lightheaded. We kept walking. It was another 20 minutes along the grass-speckled gravel and cracked ties of the railroad tracks before we finally reached the tunnel. It was cut directly into the hill, a maw of crumbling stonework that was covered on all sides by a hill coated in dead grass and withered trees. The tunnel was dark, foreboding. More than anything, I wanted to turn and run back to the safety of New York City, to take JaneRezi and go far away from this place, and to heck with whatever happened after. I started to walk towards the tunnel, and the others followed. As soon as we crossed the threshold, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the light-headed sense grew stronger, a sense of unreality that increased as we walked forward. I had made sure to bring a flashlight. JaneRezi didn't need one the way her senses worked, but the same wasn't true of me and Vriska. I clicked the light on and shined it down the tunnel, illuminating the decaying masonry of the walls and general disrepair of the tracks themselves. It was maybe 100 yards in when we saw the first of the marks on the walls. The Creator watches over us. It was simple enough, but it sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold air of the tunnel itself. In a few more feet, I saw what I had now come to expect, but it shook me all the same. Alpha, circle, omega. Alpha, omega, and the circle that binds. More than ever, I wished none of us had ever seen any of it. It would have been better if Vriska and June moved somewhere else, somewhere far away where they could make a fresh start. JaneRezi and I could stay in New York and work our cases while our anonymous donor, who was, everyone involved already knew, Jade Harley, provided us with funding. It wasn't an option anymore. I led the way as we walked down the tunnel, and a couple 100 yards away I could see a pinprick of light from the tunnel's end. I wanted to break and run, to get to the other side as fast as possible. I felt like I had been trapped inside a tomb, and the door was about to close in on me. I felt a soft hand grab my left arm and heard JaneRezi's voice near me.
It's okay. I'm with you.
It wasn't much, but I already felt calmer. We were halfway to the exit, and I was feeling more steady, less uneasy. It all still felt unreal, but it was starting to feel like I could manage it. JaneRezi kept her hand on my arm as we walked, and that helped a lot. My gal had a kind of sixth sense for emotions, whether she admitted it or not. 10 yards from the exit, and I was feeling nervous again. I could see beyond the end of the tunnel. The railway continued, and the hills rose up on either side of it. The trees were surrounding, and the natural depression of the railway. And I knew the village was somewhere inside. I wasn't sure I wanted to see what was there, to learn what secrets it held behind this veil of decay. We walked out of the tunnel, and it took my eyes a second to adjust to the light. I squinted, blinked, and the world came back into focus. Up ahead, the railroad tracks abruptly cut off, having been removed at some distant point in time for some unknown purpose. A stand of brush was piled conspicuously in the middle of the path.
It's a trap.
JaneRezi muttered, just loud enough for me to hear.
Don't do anything stupid, and don't pull your piece. If they wanted us dead, it would have already happened.
A piece of the brush moved, and a figure in a dark gray cloak moved forward. He looked just like the hitchhiker I'd seen before. The figure pulled back their hood, revealing a troll who looked strikingly similar to Carcat Vantis, the pawn shop owner in New York City. But this troll had horns that were cut off partway down. Other than that and superficial differences like hair and clothing, they could have been a twin. Vriska had her rifle up before I could say anything, but the troll only waved nonchalantly.
Please lower your weapons, my children,
he said, his voice carrying easily over the distance, but still somehow quiet.
I mean you no harm, but if it comes to violence, I will not hesitate.
The voice was pleasant to hear, but there was a real menace under the words. I believed him when he said it.
There's at least 20 of them,
JaneRezi said, still too quiet to be overheard. Vriska, drop your gun, I said, as calmly as I could possibly manage. Reaching slowly, JaneRezi and I drew out our own heaters and dropped them on the ground. The troll in front of us nodded and smiled.
Thank you, my children. If you will come with me, you will find answers to so many questions. Those you have asked yourself, and those you do not even know you need to ask yet.
The troll motioned to us.
Please, come with me.
I was getting the overwhelming sense that this wasn't a request.
Chapter 12, Within Four Walls.
Of course, the first thing I did was to black out. I swear that was part of the plan all along, and if we both stick to that story, no one can say any different. When I woke up, it had been... Actually, I wasn't sure, because I woke up in a plain room with boarded-up windows lit by a single light bulb in the center. As I struggled with the fog over my mind to regain full consciousness, I tried to take stock of the little details around me. The more I could figure out, the more I'd have to work with. Obviously, the strange troll with the filed-down horns and his posse didn't want us dead, or that would have already happened. Or at least didn't want us dead right away. That left a wide gulf of possibilities, and a lot of them were pretty bad. I wasn't going to drive myself up the wall, imagining all the various things that could happen. Instead, I kept focusing on details. I wasn't tied up. I tried to stand up, but my head was still feeling weird, and it hurt to move too fast, so I settled for sitting on crossed legs and looking around from there. The room wasn't large, maybe 10 or 15 feet square, and had a series of 3 small windows, all covered with boards. The door in the room had a heavy look to it. It was probably reinforced and almost certainly locked. The boarding on the windows looked tough, too. I seriously doubted I'd be able to break through. The walls and floor were all plain, made of what looked like pine. The only thing resembling furniture was a reed mat that I'd woken up on. Beyond that, the room was completely empty. There was a layer of dust over most of it, marked only by a set of footprints and a long, straight drag mark where I figured they'd hauled me in. A thick layer of dust surrounded the mat itself. It looked like no one had touched it in some time. After I got used to sitting for a bit, I felt comfortable with the idea of trying to stand again. Slowly, I pushed myself to my feet, bracing against the dizziness I felt coming up on me. And I was on my feet again, standing shakily, but standing nonetheless. Gosh darn, did it feel good to be able to do that. I walked the length and width of the room, and nothing stood out to me. I tried the door, which was, of course, locked. Even pushed at the boards and the windows. Those were all solid. Without any kind of tools or resources, there was no way I was going to be able to get out of here. As I walked, I tried to turn this over in my head. It was so hard to think of something as so personal as a case, but that was what I needed to do. I needed to work everything over and learn as much as I could. It didn't exactly take a genius to figure out that the Order of the Creator were the ones behind this. They'd shown themselves to have resources, and from the very evasive responses I got from in Seaward Vale, they were either in control of the town, deeply entrenched in it, or strongly allied with the residents. The attack in Boston didn't make sense. Or maybe it was someone else, some council offshoot, or something that had nothing to do with the Order. That felt off, but so did every other possible explanation.
Oh, that's cool. Welcome back. Depending on what you missed, they've just been captured by the people that live in the weird village. And Jane is woken up alone in this boarded up room with no one else there.
And the dreams had apparently been shared by a number of other people, and specifically predicted the village I was now presumably in. I had no rational explanation for those things, so my mind spent most of its time ignoring the whole situation and focusing instead on the things I could directly see and possibly explain. I paced back to the center of the room and sat down again, trying to clear my head. I needed to get the whole thing back into perspective, to see things how they were and not how I thought they were. It was a heck of a lot harder than I thought it'd be. There was a heavy knock at the door, followed by a brief pause and a grating sound of a deadbolt being withdrawn. That gave me some insight into the likelihood of being able to break the door down anyway. The door opened on creaking hinges, and the troll with the partial horns was standing there, dressed in a simple tunic and pants. He was smiling. It was deeply unsettling to see. He put his hands up.
Miss Crocker, please rest assured that I mean you no harm.
The smile widened, and I felt like I was going to be sick.
May I come into the room?
He didn't move toward me, and this whole thing felt so off. I finally nodded, and the troll took a few steps inside and knelt down on one knee.
Your passing out had nothing to do with us. You simply fainted away. Your friends have already been seen to their own quarters. I apologize for the sparse nature of your accommodations. Please understand that this is merely temporary.
Can I get a bucket, at least? The troll frowned.
You will be taken to the restroom shortly. When you have demonstrated a willingness to abide by our rules, I will happily move you to a more pleasant environment with proper facilities.
Where's June? I figured I'd start with a major question on my mind.
Don't you want to know to know who we are? Who I am? Why you're here?
This fellow was as dense as a Christmas fruitcake. I figure it doesn't matter. You'll either tell me or you won't. But I've got a strong sense you know where that gal is. The troll shrugged.
Very well. We do have this June Egbert in our care. She is alive and quite unharmed. All of you will remain if you cooperate.
I snorted.
Yeah.
I'll bet. Otherwise you'll send a goon to kill us on the street, right? The troll frowned deeply. He seemed genuinely hurt by what I said.
That was not my doing. One of our members decided to act recklessly. If Miss Circuit had not already killed him, I would have addressed the matter personally.
The weirdest thing about it was, I believed him. He didn't strike me as lying or trying to trick me. What about the others?
They're all fine,
the troll said, spreading his arms out in front of himself.
Miss Lalande and Miss Circuit are both being kept here. Miss Pyrope as well. All separately, of course, at least until we can determine if you are all willing to cooperate.
I wish JaneRezi was there to tell me for sure, but he didn't seem like he was lying. From his perspective, this was all fine and dandy. What was a little bit of kidnapping? Okay, I said. So who the heck are you, and why are we here? The troll grinned. This seemed to please him immensely.
My name is Cancri Ventus, and I am the current tender of the Order of the Creator. You are all here because you have a special role to play in the coming years. My job is to prepare you all for this, so that you might fulfill your destinies.
This sounded similar enough to all the other nonsense I'd been hearing that it didn't especially surprise me, but something about actually hearing someone say it out loud. It was a strange experience, to put it in the mildest terms I can. This fellow actually believed every word he was saying. Every single word. Destinies? Sometimes the easiest way to get information was basically to pretend you didn't know what the heck they were even talking about. Cancri clucked his tongue and shook his head.
No. It's not that simple. It's so much for you to all see at once. I can't just tell you. I have to show you, and you're not ready for that yet.
That was an ominous statement, one that had me back on my heels.
No, actually there's no fish people thing here. The weird village thing is legit, but the fish people aren't part of this. I could have really leaned into the Lovecraft stuff, except that he was basically just using that as a metaphor for racism, so I didn't want to go too far into referencing Lovecraft. Yeah, exactly.
Can you at least tell me where everyone is? What's going to happen to us?
Your friends are all safe in our community. That is all I can tell you for now, I'm afraid. As to what is going to happen to you, that is largely up to you to decide.
Cancri stood up again and stretched.
I am afraid I must go tend to other matters now, Miss Crocker. Someone will be by shortly with some food for you.
He left the room without another word, closing the door and moving the noisy deadbolt back into place. I was alone again in the sealed room. I lay down with my back against the reed mat and stared up at the ceiling.
Hold on a second.
I realized I'd fallen asleep when I awoke to the sound of the deadbolt being opened again. Bolting upright, I reached for a revolver that was definitely not there. Feeling foolish, I sat there on the mat and waited as the door swung open again. Standing in the doorway was another troll. They were dressed in what looked like a green soldier's trench coat and had unkempt hair and a harried, uneasy expression. The troll opened their mouth and spoke in a quiet, small voice.
Oh crap, I forgot I had this character in there. I could have a voice for him.
Ginner, They were holding a tray with a bowl and a mug on it. Their voice was soft and light, feminine. Her? I wasn't sure. Troll gender was still a thing I wasn't entirely clear on. The troll set the tray down inside the room and back off to the door. Wait, who are you? Can you at least tell me where my friends are? The troll shook her head quickly, her eyes darting around. She closed the door and the deadbolt was back in place. I got up and walked to the tray. The bowl contained a thick stew that looked like it was mostly potatoes and turnips. I tried a piece cautiously and found it bland but not entirely unappealing. I hadn't realized how hungry I was, and I couldn't remember the last time I had actually had something to eat. Before I knew it, I had finished the stew. The mug was just water, but I downed it greedily. I knew everyone was alive, or at least I knew Cancry claimed everyone was alive. I didn't really see what he would gain from lying about it, and it did seem like he was interested in at least keeping us alive, even if it wasn't exactly comfortable. That meant something. Maybe meant a lot. The most frustrating part was that after everything, even after being pulled right into the heart of the thing, I still had basically no idea what was happening. Foreboding dreams and ominous breadcrumb statements all felt like they had a lot of meaning, but ultimately they didn't tell me anything useful. It wasn't very helpful to know that something was coming if I had no idea what that something was. I lay back down and closed my eyes. I was going to at least try to get back to sleep and turn those things over in my mind a bit more. The first thought I had when I woke up was that I had no idea what time it was, and that bothered me. They'd taken my pocket watch along with everything else. Once I was awake enough to have additional thoughts, I found myself wondering why I hadn't dreamed. It seemed like if there was anywhere the dreams would be at the worst, it would be the very place that they had foretold. But I had slept remarkably well for a gal who had been taken hostage and stuck in a locked room with only a reed mat for comfort. It wasn't a very high bar to clear, but I was sailing right on over it. After what seemed like 10 or 15 minutes of this same cycle of thoughts, I heard the always noisy deadbolt door, and the door swung inward to reveal the troll who'd brought me dinner. She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear.
Cancry said to take you out to use the toilet. Please, don't do anything bad to me.
I realized she was absolutely terrified of me. Whether that was the result of some personality thing on her end or stories that had been told about me, I wasn't sure on that. But she was absolutely scared out of her wits.
No, there are no OCs in this. You'll find out who this character is in a second. Eventually. I don't remember when I name her. No, this is like repurposing all the Homestuck characters.
I'm not going to hurt you, I said quietly. I just want to take my friends and go home. The troll shook her head and looked down.
I'm sorry. We aren't allowed.
I stood up and walked over toward the troll at the door. She stepped back to let me through. As I cleared the door, I saw...
Or I should say there's no OCs that are like major characters. There's a lot of like unnamed random characters.
I saw that she was holding a small pistol in her hand. So running off probably wouldn't be a good call. Good to know. I filed it away for future reference. Outside of the room, I was in a short hallway with the same pine floor and walls as my room. There were 2 other doors like mine down the hallway, and a door leading outside. The troll motioned for me to walk to the door. Who else is here? I asked. No answer, of course. As I walked past the second door, I thought I heard a faint tap from inside, someone rapping their knuckles against the heavy door. It was barely audible, but I made a note of it all the same. When I opened the door, I was hit by a wave of fresh air and cool morning light. The building I'd been inside was a small pine lodge standing on a slightly raised foundation. Nearby, I could see other similar buildings of various sizes and configurations, all nestled in the middle of the trees. Through the trees, there was a larger lodge visible looming up over the tree line into the tree line. This looked like some kind of common building, most likely. I felt my troll guard tap me on the shoulder.
We're going to that building. You get to use the toilet, and then Cancry said he wanted to see you.
I didn't have any my actual literal private eye hat with me, but I was going to put on my best private eye hat and take in every detail I could. This might be the last chance I had for a while to get to see this village and figure out where everything was. That was basically my only hope of seeing my friends again and getting the heck out of there. The troll walked ahead of me, motioning for me to follow. She had brushed ahead with barely a sound, and again it occurred to me that trying to make a break for it might not be the best choice I could make. Instead, I followed quietly and paid attention.
Chapter 13, A Sense of Destiny.
There were trolls making their way around the village, going about their morning routine. But there were a fair number of humans as well. As far as I could tell, it was a pretty even mix of men and women, both the trolls and humans, without any particular distinction being made. They didn't say anything to either me or my taciturn escort. In fact, I noticed a fair few of them actively avoided even looking at us. They were afraid, but I doubted it was me they were afraid of. I don't really think that it's especially important to describe the mechanics of me using the toilet. The bathroom itself was a separate building from the larger lodge, so I didn't get a sense of the layout of the building. A lot of people were going in and out of it, and I could smell something cooking inside. I figured that was where they all gathered to eat. When I was done in the toilet, the troll guard had me following her again on a path that led up through the woods, past the lodge. In the distance, off to the side, I could see a clearing in the middle of the trees where a number of people were gathered around what looked like a large hole in the ground. I wanted to ask what they were doing, but I got the feeling that my guard would either be unwilling or unable to give me an answer. We walked for a good 10 minutes through the woods before we arrived at our obvious destination, a large pine lodge. I was sensing a theme in the middle of a small clearing.
I don't know who this is supposed to be.
The front door had a large troll with long hair and horns that looked like they belonged to a bull.
Nepeta.
The troll said with a nod as we approached.
Boss is waiting inside.
Without another word, the big troll stepped aside and let us through. My guard, whose name I now knew was Nepeta, stepped off to the side. Once we were in the lodge, the door opened directly into a main room filled with comfortable, rustic furniture. Sitting in a wooden chair was Cankry, his legs outstretched.
Come, sit, Miss Crocker. Or Jane. May I call you Jane?
I shrugged, walking over to the seat, take a seat across from him. Sure, why not? You've already kidnapped me, so what's one more thing on top of that? He shook his head.
Far from it, Jane. You came to my village.
No Equius in this one, but, or the next one. I might put him in a future one, but not in the trilogy here.
You came to my village. I had every right to kill you on the spot, but instead took you into my custody for your own safety. Maybe you don't see it that way right now, but that is most assuredly the truth.
I had a hard time believing this, but it was good to know how he felt generally regarding the idea of killing me and my own volition. Okay, sure, but what about June? You kidnapped her.
Jane, you are getting ahead of yourself. Aren't you curious about how we even got to this place?
No, not really. I wasn't sure how much I'd be able to get away with antagonizing Cankry, but I was also mad as heck.
Well, you will have to humor me, because I have a bit of a tale for you.
I suppose that I wasn't actually going anywhere, so I simply nodded and let him continue.
Once upon a time, there were two families of sorts, the human Lalans and the Alternian Circuits.
Okay, I already know this story, I interrupted. The Lalans and the Circuits founded a village, which I assume is this village, and something bad happened and it burned down.
Ah,
Cankry smiled knowingly.
But there is more to that story than perhaps you know. If you've heard this story, I would imagine you know how the Lalans, practicing their own form of witchcraft, chose to form an alliance with the Circuits, adopt a communal human family structure, and form this village before everything collapsed and ended in fire. That is a partially true story, or a partially complete story. You see, despite my youthful appearance, I am in fact Violet Lalan and Spinneret Circuit's contemporary. I was one of the first to join them in their village.
Spinneret. That was the name Rose hadn't known. Of course she didn't. She was a baby or a very small child when everything had happened.
It was a truly wonderful idea. Instead of the hemo spectrum and the oppressive blood classes, Alternians could live together as a community. We would adopt the most idealistic of the human interpretations of family and they would adopt our innate familiarity with certain magical traditions. We would live together in peace and harmony. And for a while, it was true. But I discovered certain things in this village, ancient things, things that foretold great events to come. I uncovered evidence that would involve all of us in a grand destiny. Not as Lalans or circuits like some kind of overgrown human dynasty, but as individuals bound by fate. I told Violet and Spinneret of this, and they laughed at me. They saw only their own banal sort of magic and their close-minded worship of elder beings. So I quietly gathered my followers, those loyal not to some charismatic individual, but to the very idea of this destiny itself. Of course, the Lalans and the circuits did not take kindly to this when they heard the whispers of what I was doing. Such is often the case. Visionaries are often persecuted and reviled for what we know. I was still perfectly willing to allow them to continue their childish games, but they insisted that I not be allowed to simply exist as who I was always meant to be. I had no choice but to expose Violet for the heretic she was. She chose not only to disbelieve, but to actively work against me. It was regrettable what had to happen to Spinneret. And then Violet responded with such violence, the fire that consumed much of the village and her with it. I had assumed that all their line died in that blaze. And I mourned them all. Even as I went off to rally my growing following and rebuild, I was saddened that they had not been able to come to the same truth as myself in time. They would have been wonderful allies, but chose only to fight me at every possible opportunity. Imagine my surprise when I learned that not one but two of each of the bloodlines had survived. The circuits in Boston and the Lalans in New York City. And while they remembered little of what they had been through, I knew that there was potential to bring them back into the fold if they were willing.
It was a bunch of rambling nonsense I was hearing, but it explained a lot. At the same time, there were questions hanging open that felt important. The importance of June in this whole thing being one of the big ones.
That is the basic picture of it,
Cancri said.
Obviously, the full story is considerably more nuanced, but I have a long history with the Lalans and the circuits, one that is often fraught with disaster. But none of that is the fault of the younger members of their families. I hold no ill will towards any of them. All of the older generation are dead now.
He said it with such matter-of-fact way that it sent chills down my back. I was very much reminded of the kind of casual murderers that had made the New York Council such an absolute nightmare. Maybe Cancri put a prettier flourish around it, but it was still very much there. So how do I fit into the picture then, or JaneRezi? Cancri smiled.
Directly speaking, you don't. But you tangled yourselves up so directly with the Lalans and the circuits that you've become de facto involved with this. There is more to tell, of course, but for now, I think you should be brought back to your quarters to reflect on what you've learned. That is, after all, a process.
I was back in the pine room with the reinforced door, by myself. Nepeta had led me back in silence, and my attempts to draw some more information out of her had been met only with a nervous kind of avoidance. Once I was back in my quarters, I decided to test a theory I had. I walked to the wall of the room closest to the other cells in this building. With my fist, I banged as hard as I could against the wall, sending a dull thud through the wall. After a second, I heard a responding thud coming from far away. Someone was on the other end of the rooms. "Vriska!" I shouted, as loud as I could, and waited. Nothing. "JaneRezi!" I waited again. Thud. I thanked heaven that it was her. Not only was my gal alive, but she had some unique skills that would be able to help a lot. "Can you hear me?" I lowered my voice to my normal volume and hoped. There was no way I'd be able to hear her back. I didn't have JaneRezi's gifts, but there was at least a chance we'd be able to have a conversation, of sorts. Thud. That was good. Once for yes, two for no. Thud. Did they take you to the main house yet? Thud, thud. Do you know where the others are? No. That wasn't good. If anyone would be able to figure that out, it was JaneRezi. Have they let you into the compound at all? Yes. Do you know anything else about what's happening out there? No. Do you know a way out of these rooms? No. It wasn't surprising, even if it was frustrating. I felt exhausted by all of this. I wanted to lie down and sleep. Waking up, that was basically optional at that point. I decided that I would try to get some rest. They'd wake me up if there was something else happening, and there was no way I was getting out of here right now. JaneRezi? Yes. I'm going to try to sleep for a bit. I love you. I love you so much. Yes. I smiled, walked back to my mat, and curled up to try to pass some time. I suppose I had actually slept, because when I came to, someone was opening the door. It was Nepeta holding another tray of food. She looked even more nervous than before as she walked into the room, but this time she closed the door behind her. I had no idea what was coming next. Nepeta walked closer to where I sat, looked around as if someone might be watching her, and leaned down to where I was.
Your friend June is in the big house. Cankry wants her for something specific, but hasn't told me what.
She said it quickly and quietly.
I'm scared of him, but I can't leave. There's nowhere for me to go. My big sister Mulin left a long time ago, and then...
She was crying quietly. Tears streaked over her cheeks.
He killed her when he found out what she did. He says he wants to help people, but he's lying.
Nepeta sat down heavily next to me, and I scooted over slightly toward her. She leaned in, and I was hugging her as she cried.
I don't want to be here anymore. You and your friends, you're not supposed to be here. This is a bad, evil place.
She lowered her voice again.
I know where Rose is. She gave me something to give to you.
Nepeta passed me a folded piece of paper. She looked around furtively again and stood up, leaving the food tray there for me. Quickly and quietly she left the room, locking the door behind her. I unfolded the paper and saw Rose's neat handwriting in pencil.
Yeah, this is like Cankry as a full-on like cult leader, basically. Although there's something interesting that happens with him toward the end of the story.
Jane, I was able to convince Nepeta to get this paper and pencil for me. She's a good person, and I believe she can be trusted. She told me that you and JaneRezi are being held in one building, and that June is in the main house. Cankry talked to me once already, and said some vague stuff about my destiny, and how I'm connected to everything because of my family. He told me the rest of the story about my mom and Spinneret. I think he's probably leaving more out, but I can't make him tell me, and I feel like he wants to keep me in the dark in particular. I'm in a separate structure set back from the main village. I'm not sure exactly why, but I think they're afraid of me specifically. When they took me to the bathroom, I could see that they're digging something up out there. I don't know what, but I feel like it's calling to me. If that makes any sense at all, I can feel what they're digging up out there. It scares the shit out of me. Something big is happening here. Don't try to reply. Nepeta can pass messages, but she's in great danger for doing so. They will absolutely kill her if they find out. I feel like Cankry will speak to us again soon. I think I'll have a better idea of how to act at that point. Hide this under your mat and make sure it isn't discovered. Rose. It wasn't much, but seeing that note gave me a renewed sense of hope. At the very least, it gave me a sense of a plan. A plan was something I could work with. Alright, let's see. Okay, trying to think of where... Yeah, I definitely want to stop. So I'm going to stop about now because this is a good place to break, and then like the next time I'll finish reading this because like a bunch of stuff happens really quickly. Hold on, let me use my sweet transition. Bloop. Computer go off. Yeah, next time I'm going to finish reading this. There's a lot of stuff that happens in the last 6 chapters like really fast. And I don't want to like stop in the middle of it because yeah, it would be like it wouldn't feel right. So yeah, thank you for everyone that decided to tune in and listen. I had a few people in here, so that's cool. Whoever's still in chat, thank you for listening. Cool. Yeah, I'm glad you liked it. I think you'll enjoy the. Thank you both. I think you'll both really enjoy the ending. Some really like cool stuff happens toward the end, and it like really leans into the sort of like weird horror vibe that's going on. So, yeah, I had a good time reading as always. I appreciate it. If you're not Bucky and Clever, tune into the Will at Homestuck Twitch tomorrow. That's twitch.tv/Will at Homestuck. They're going to be reading some fanfic as always. So that's always a good time. Fun and chat, all that good stuff. I will be reading again next week, same time, same place, all that good stuff. So again, thank you very much for reading, and I will see y'all later. Bye.